welcome to the 2021 SPPA, or School of Public Policy and Administration, Open House. I'm Jennifer Stewart. I'm the director of the school. Today, we're inviting you into our school to learn about the importance of well-designed public policy and a strong public administration in dealing with the current challenges facing society today. For the first hour of today's open house, 3 of our faculty members will discuss the policy problems that their research addresses. James Meadowcroft is going to start by discussing environmental politics and sustainable development and his work with the Transition Accelerator, a research initiative looking towards a net zero future. Katherine Minich, her research focuses on Indigenous self-determination. Her research started looking at Indigenous health issues and now focuses on policy process and the intersection of Canadian and Inuit governance. Marc-André Gagnon is an expert in pharmaceutical policy. In addition to this being his research area, he's a frequent public commentator on the issues. He's going to speak about the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and what it has highlighted in terms of pharmaceutical policy. I would like to ask James Meadowcroft to discuss the net zero future.
Thank you very much. So the title of my talk today is Accelerating the Transition to Net Zero. So obviously climate change is one of the most burning public policy issues of our time. And many of you perhaps will have been following in the newspapers the developments at the Glasgow Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention, where they've been hammering out targets and measures for the next decade and beyond. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Canada's engagement with climate change. So I'm going to start with this chart of Canada's emissions trajectory, actually the G7 and the European Union, and what their emissions have been since 1990 when climate change emerged on the international agenda, and how we've done in terms of targets. And this, so I could actually talk for an hour on this chart alone without any particular problem, but here I'll make up just a couple of points. So the black numbers that you see on that chart are Canada's objectives over time, our emissions objectives in the original Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Commitment, the Copenhagen Commitment. And what you can see is we missed every single one of our targets. So Canada's emissions are that one at the top, which show that after 30 years of climate action, our emissions are 21% what they were above when we began saying this was a big problem. And many people think that Canada is just kind of one of the pack. Everybody has a hard time with this. It's a real challenge. Absolutely true. But no, we are actually the outlier among the industrialized countries. And if you look at even the United States, which we usually point our finger at, has got back to its 1990 levels by around 2020. Japan, a little bit of reduction. France, the EU is minus 28%. And countries like Germany and UK are already by 2020 down to almost half the greenhouse gas emissions they were producing when we kind of fired the starting gun. And if you notice the targets, the things in purple on the right-hand side are the targets. Many of these advanced countries have really ambitious targets for 2030. Canada's target is now minus 45%. So the reason these percentages don't add up is the purple writing is from the original 1990 starting gate, and we recalibrated our target from 2005. So what would have been 26% from where we were in 1990 actually works out to a 40 to 45% reduction target in 9 years. Extremely challenging. And we'll have to do a lot if we don't want to break our normal record of missing everything. So what are some of the challenges that Canada has had? Well, firstly, Obviously, we're a major oil and gas producer and exporter, and oil and gas production creates greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly the oil sands has dramatically increased over the past 20 years, its production, and that's with high carbon intensity economy. In other words, our economy was built out in competition with Europe and other places because our advantage was we have cheap natural resources. So we built our cities outward and we use lots of energy and we produce lots of raw materials. We have very diverse regional energy political economies. Our provinces look way more different among them than the European countries look among the 30 or more countries in Europe. In particular, we have a province like Alberta that basically floats on hydrocarbons, exports them, and uses coal for its power generation. Contrast this with Quebec or BC that are almost entirely hydro provinces and built out industries that relate to that. We have decentralized constitution that makes it hard for the federal government to take unilateral action because the provinces own the resources. And we have very close economic integration with the US. And of course, the US has this on again, off again climate policy. When the Democrats are in, they incent the world to join ambitious targets. And as soon as the Republicans get in, they quit the agreement. And this obviously creates problems for an economy that's closely linked to the US. Of course, these are difficulties. They aren't an excuse. Each country has its own difficulties. The problem really is that we have not framed the challenge correctly, and we have diluted our efforts. We've done a little bit of a lot, but not very much of anything. And we've had endless debates over pipelines and carbon pricing, which you may well have followed. So when I say the problem isn't framed correctly, by this, what I mean basically is the science has long shown that the only way to deal with climate change is to stop emitting greenhouse gases. So this is not a question of like reducing them 20% or 40% or 50%. This is, you just have to stop. And the sooner you stop, the sooner the open-ended warning ends. So getting net zero, which is the international objective, and Canada has now signed on to it a couple of years ago, is that any residual greenhouse emissions must be canceled by absorptions. So why is this so hard? So firstly, 75% of our energy in Canada and even 80% globally comes from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels emit greenhouse gases, so you have to break that habit. Secondly, there are non-energy related emissions, even though about 80% of emissions come from energy. Agriculture produces emissions from animal agriculture, nitrogen fertilizers. There are emissions produced from certain industrial processes like cement production, from waste and so on. These emissions may be in some ways even harder to deal with than the energy related emissions. And many of what we call negative emissions technologies, these are the way of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so rolling back the damage we've done by burning all these fossil fuels, are extremely uncertain. So yes, you can plant trees, but we may need the land for other things. And will those trees last, or will they burn up in a forest fire or something like that? There's something called direct air capture, where you literally suck the CO2 out of the air, but it's extremely expensive, and we don't know if we can do it at the necessary scale. So what that basically means is you have to drive all your economic sectors towards as close as you can get to absolute zero, i.e. just don't emit greenhouse gases. Stupid. I won't go into this graph, but this is the kind of thing that public policy makers have to be thinking about. It shows that 3/4 of our energy is satisfied by fossil fuels still, that 60% of the fossil fuels produced in Canada are exported almost exclusively to the United States. Electricity satisfies about 20% of our demand, and you can see where it comes from: nuclear, hydro, wind, and so on. But the little clouds show you where the GHGs are coming from. 1/4 are coming from oil and gas extraction, another 1/4 from transport, which is almost all running on oil and diesel. Next is buildings, and then a little bit from industry, agriculture, and so on. So if you want to deal with the problem, that's where you have to deal with the emissions. This is a quick vision slide. Again, this is the kind of slide one could talk for a long time about, but it shows what a net zero energy system would have to look like, which means that much more of the end use has to be supplied by electricity. So no gasoline for cars, no burning of natural gas in homes. And we probably need a carrier like hydrogen in order to supplement what electricity can do. Much more important role for wind, solar, perhaps nuclear, hydro, i.e. non-emitting electricity producers, and no GHGs from the end use whatsoever. And any residual GHGs have to be sucked up by negative emissions technologies. What does it mean to accelerate transitions today? We have to stop muddling along. We have to adopt a strategic pathway approach, focus on changing the systems, not incremental. So in other words, what thing will switch our transport system to being net zero, not how do we squeeze out another 2 or 3% over the next couple of years. From the government, this means what we call mission-driven innovation policy and green industrial policy so that we make a place for Canada in the economy of the future. I, with a number of other academics and some Canadian foundations, we founded something called the Transition Accelerator about 1.5 years ago. At the beginning of this year, we published this report called Pathways to Net Zero, which was basically about which kinds of technologies and social innovation can propel us to net zero over the next couple of decades. This is just showing you an example of the kind of work that we do. So here we're compelling across a series of criteria across the top how good 2 technological options are. So one of these, I just picked 2 because it shows the contrast. One is a battery electric vehicle, and the other is blending ethanol, which is produced from plants, from corn, into gasoline. And basically, we judge them on these different criteria. And the kind of punchline is ethanol is stupid. Don't invest in it, because these blends still would have some gasoline. So they emit greenhouse gases, but more than that, we can't produce enough plant-based ethanol in Canada to run our whole transport system. So you need to take a leap to a completely new technology, not combustion-based. And in this case, it would be battery electric vehicles. We've done this for critical sectors of the Canadian economy. I won't go through these, but you can see that power, in other words, how we get electricity, is about 9% of our emissions. We know how to do that. We should drive that forward. Electrification of cars will take place over the next decade, 15 years, hopefully. It can get, another 13% of our emissions and so on. And in each of these, we look at what the changes in the sector will be, not just how to make emissions go down, but how to actually have a better transport system that's low emissions, how to have a better agri-food system, but that is also low emission. And so to kind of sum up, I would say, what then for Canada do we need? We need policy that focuses our attention on things that can make system change now. So that means electrified transport, fully decarbonized electricity, and getting to work on buildings. We need to drive down the fossil fuel production emissions. And you may have seen the Prime Minister announce that in Glasgow that Canada would be, in the next couple of months, imposing a cap on the oil and gas industry for emissions that will gradually decline over time. And then we need to work on some of the less mature sectors where the technological and social options aren't yet mature. And I would include things in there like to do with agriculture, heavy transport, and so on. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, James. That really shows how much we need strong public sector to move us towards a sustainable future. I'd like to invite Katherine now to speak about her research. Thanks, Katherine.
Great, thanks, and thank you, everybody. I am without a PowerPoint, but I feel like I sometimes speak a little bit better without having some crutches to rely on. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what are the opportunities in looking at Indigenous policy. And I like to start off a little bit with an exercise. You don't have to put your hands up about this, but I just sort of think about and position yourself as a Canadian, right? And I recognize that some people are potentially joining us from elsewhere. So maybe you can think about this in your own sort of nation context about that. But how many of you might identify yourself as a first generation Canadian, right? You're not necessarily, you were not born here, but you're living here and you will be the first generation as a Canadian in your family. You know, alternatively, if you're a second generation, so one of your parents were born in Canada, at least one of them, if not both of them. So that makes you a second generation Canadian. And let's take this a bit further and let's, you know, to be inclusive, third generation or more, right? So if your parents you were born in Canada, your parents were born in Canada, and deeper, right? There's the magical seventh generation is one of the Indigenous teachings that are brought forward. So in 2011, 7 million people in Canada were first generation. As well, in 2011, about 6 million were second generation Canadians. And the bulk of Canadians, 20 million or more, were third generation Canadians. So I just wanted to use these figures to try to illuminate for us a little bit of where Indigenous policy comes in, and also what are the opportunities, right? So what has Canada created and fostered? Some of the old thoughts and ideas, right? So as Canada was created and built, it was a land of peace, right? A lot of people will come to Canada because there is not war. Treaties were signed with Indigenous peoples, ensuring that there would be peace. There's also the movement towards creating Canada, not only settler colonialism in a way, but as a nation of immigrants, and lots of people were welcome to create policy and a national identity that was an opportunity for land and resources to accompany sovereignty, right? That ability for the nation state to create some things. But for Indigenous people, this meant a lot of oppression, genocide, deterritorialization, and land, right? Land grabs, for lack of a better word. And so those were some of the old thoughts and old ideas, and these have changed, right? There's changes towards this. So too has there been changes on what it means to be Canadian, right? People coming to Canada, as I had mentioned, you know, in search of belonging. They may not be coming to Canada to escape or to be refugees, but they're also quite voluntarily coming for better opportunity to access, you know, land, space. Other places in the world are getting really crowded, and Canada has some space and place for that. So there's been shifts there in terms of, you know, old ideas about coming to Canada. If you know, families were recruited to come and be laborers and farmers and the like. And then today, you know, people are coming to Canada for a variety of potentially similar, but also shifts in those attitudes for opportunity, again, for continued peace, jobs, opportunities there. And then for Indigenous peoples, some older ideas definitely were part of treaties, right? They're negotiating an agreement to coexist in peace and to share, right? To be a part of a bicultural, bilingual environments between either English or French speakers, and to create peace, to agree not to war. And so original ideas and visions of what were in original treaties had shifted, right, during periods of intense colonialism and the like. And so hence we've gone through periods of really aggressive genocide and assimilation. And then today, some of those shifts that are noticeable by Indigenous peoples in terms of also looking for opportunities to decolonize, opportunities to, you know, join economies, but in a way that they can be a part of industries, whether this be forestry or energy and the like, and done so in ways that aspire to adhere to Indigenous principles. But there is also, right, the ongoing enjoyment of peace. So I'll talk a little bit too about periods of resistance and what those resistance look like from an Indigenous lens. So I just wanted to share with you that there has been shifts in social attitudes and ideas and values towards how Indigenous peoples can be included. And I think one of the things for Canada, right, Canada continues to consider the cost of what it is to support Indigenous peoples through policy decisions. So these have become costs. But there's also an interest in fairness, right? In reconciliation and what that looks like. But there's also the continued idea of control and what this means, right? The Constitution and all the provinces, they lay out, as even James pointed out, so there's some decentralized methods. And so where does Indigenous values, where do Indigenous rights sit? Exclusively with the federal government, yet Indigenous peoples live in over 600 different communities in Canada. So it's a really incompatible approach to think of that. So I think when it comes to that understanding of what Canada is doing towards its changes and policy processes, right? So this is how some of those values are changed. For Indigenous peoples, it also often comes through court decisions, right? It's been Indigenous peoples taking the government of Canada to court, and then those orders and those decisions should translate back into government policy. And so some of the variety of things that continue to come out, because it takes a long time for items to go through the judicial system, but we're talking about land title, which was 1972, not too long ago that issue was addressed, and it's still differently implemented throughout the provinces. Access to hunting and fishing. Again, some of these values, we saw a contemporary issue just 2 years ago in the Atlantic with respect to the lobster fishery and the Indigenous people's access to lobsters and fishery. So very contemporary issues, still about environment. I know that the Inuit Circumpolar Conference were attending the Conference of the Parties, and also bringing up some of those issues where Indigenous peoples are hit first and hit worst, right, by climate change. And there are things, Shilawak Kluche talking about the right to be cold, and how is it that the world can listen to these barometers and experiences, not only in the far Arctic, but in places like Standing Rock, right? So in the middle of the United States, where stopping a pipeline from coming through, and adhering to some of the values of environmental and the like, not only talking as well about this, what it's like to be a survivor on the other side of genocide, and the challenges that this comes with in terms of sort of coming out through the other side of a lot of the social problems, and what it's like to have side effects of colonization occurring, right, in intimate spaces, in the family, in the community, and this could either be reserve or on reserve, and the like. In urban cities or parts of communities, we can discuss erasure. We can also discuss fraudulent claims to Indigenous identity and why that happens. And so these are a variety of things that we talk about in either contemporary issues with Indigenous public policy and administration. I wanted to also emphasize then that why an historical and a cultural analysis are important to some of these places, because Indigenous people have a lot to offer. I think when you start to look at the broad scope of how Indigenous peoples are engaging the court system and the resulting decisions that are made, and then the resulting activities of the government, and you've got great analyses of different policy actors and different strategies that are used, and different composition of a lot of different players in there. So it is about place and people, right? So the places across Canada, I mentioned there's over 600 First Nation communities. There are 4 Inuit regions in Canada. There's over, I believe, 20 Métis settlements in Canada as well. So these are places where Indigenous peoples have and continue to make contributions to both their communities and their surrounding communities, and how that has this multiple jurisdiction and also this level of intergovernmentality, right? How do intergovernmental affairs interact and work? So these are newer and evolving spaces that Indigenous peoples are contributing, I think, to the Canadian policy sphere, especially how self-governments, which are, they're becoming new employers, they are becoming interesting spaces where they are using cultural frameworks. If we think about the 90+ calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how those frameworks and those calls not only to Canadians, but to professional associations, and how those are adhered to. and grown. And so I just wanted to sort of end on this part because I was really jealous of James's graphs and all of those quantitative pieces. So I'm just going to borrow on how to imagine the 92 calls to actions from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and only 5 of those over the last several years have actually had any action on. So we're in a deficit, right? There are many more calls to actions that need to be addressed and assembled to look at the timeline of how can those changes be implemented so that there is, the balance of reconciliation for Indigenous peoples to be active and included in many facets of Canadian society. That not only includes like the attitudinal perspectives of Canadians who are coming from well over 200 countries around the globe, who are coming for opportunity and peace, and how can they share that same experience with Indigenous peoples, because that's a shared part, but also to be able to interact with and call to the government, right, about what are those needs for control, or for as you might find a space within the public service to really examine the historical and cultural analysis that Indigenous peoples are bringing forward to those policy tables.
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine. Marc-André.
Fantastic. Well, hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure. Okay, pandemics and public policy. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Well, I thought we were, but this morning, AstraZeneca, the drug manufacturer, with one of the vaccines from AstraZeneca, and AstraZeneca had this agreement that until there will be no profit made on the vaccine until the pandemic is over. And they announced this morning that for them, officially, the pandemic was over and they would start charging an additional margin for profit on their vaccine. So I don't know if it's a good news or not, but officially now it's still it's becoming unclear if we're in the middle of a pandemic or not. Pandemics have been, in fact, a huge issue during all of human history. And the shaping of social structures, the shaping of public policy of states has been in many ways shaped by these pandemics. So this is just a bit of a visual in terms of the different pandemics. You have the Black Death, smallpox in 16th century. In the 19th century, the third plague, cholera, Spanish flu, beginning of the 20th century. HIV/AIDS, which is a huge pandemic in many ways, and now we have COVID, 5 million dead, I checked this morning. Now, over human history, Black Death in the 14th century, in many ways, so it killed something like a quarter of the European population in 4 years. So what it meant is it required the necessity to move the population around, to move peasants. Basically, it required labor mobility. And to have labor mobility, you need to pay for your workers. So development of wage labor that will lead to basically to getting out of the feudal structures that were in place during the Middle Ages. So many authors consider that this pandemic has been central in getting out of the feudal system. When we think about the conquest of the Americas, for example, it is estimated that more or less 90% of the indigenous population died in the 16th century. And so, yes, it's European powers conquering, and there was lots of massacres involved, but there was no military superiority of the Europeans in the 16th century. What played a major role in the conquest was something very stupid in the sense that, well, with Europeans, they were raising cattle, they had stock breeding. And with the proximity of stock breeding, so the proximity of germs, they developed a immunity system that was more prepared for some of the diseases. And smallpox has been what was central in decimating a lot of the population in the Americas. So it's not military superiority. It was really an issue based on the pandemics at the time. Okay, smallpox is also interesting. So this is two kids that got smallpox. One was vaccinated, the other not. Smallpox is interesting for that. Well, there was cowpox with stock breeding. So cowpox, somebody found, Jenner found that basically creates some natural immunity against smallpox. So he developed a vaccine out of that at the end of the 18th century, so 1797. Beginning of vaccines in the 19th century. Keep in mind that, you know, some people going back to the 19th century in terms of, oh, there was anti-vaxxers. It's a different game. At the time, the debate over vaccines, keep in mind, we did not have the, how do you call this, the hypodermal syringes in order to inoculate the vaccine. At the end of the 19th century, you had that for the rich people, but for the poor people, basically, we're still using broken glass in order to cut open the flesh and inoculate product. With this type of practices, let's just say that there was a lot of adverse effects, to say the least, and the vaccination campaign could become very problematic very rapidly. Now, so Edward Jenner in 1797, and the eradication campaign organized at the end of the 1960s managed to eradicate the smallpox at the end of the 1970s. Cholera, and well, basically in the 19th century, cholera, typhus, yellow fever, syphilis, the third plague, Russian flu. It was interesting because most of these diseases are transmitted through infected water, parasites, mosquitoes, sexually transmitted disease. The problem is the science wasn't there in the 19th century. So in terms of science, there was two main schools of thought. One was, I mean, everybody was thinking in terms of disease, in terms of spontaneous generation. So it wasn't the idea, well, there's a virus or a germ that starts multiplying in the body, which creates the symptoms and everything. It was spontaneous generation, but there was two theories. One was about infection, what we call the miasma theory. So when we see these masks with the long beaks, basically it's just if I'm infected through the air. So miasma theory is the idea you have bad air. There's something vitiated in the air. So, you know, the disease malaria, this is Italian for malaria, bad air, basically. So the thing is not to be infected, so you can wear this type of mask and you put some camphor, mint, whatever, so some good odor, and then you're protected against the disease. So, I mean, miasma theory makes sense when some viruses are airborne, but this wasn't, let's just say, a good theory to protect ourselves. The other theory was this idea of contagion, so through contact. Disease is transmitted through contact. And that was interesting because in the 19th century, with this idea of contagion, then you can develop preventative measures. Okay, quarantine, isolation, social distancing, disinfecting. The problem in Canada is that we have this trade mostly with the UK, and the boats come in through the St. Lawrence River. Basically, with this idea of contagion, it's this idea, well, we must quarantine every new boat that comes into the country. So for the business elite in Canada, this theory was less interesting because that was slowing down trade and that was going against their economic interests. In the 19th century, in fact, so in Canada, what we did, I mean, this is the beginning of the Public Health Agency in Canada, the quarantine station at Gros-Îles near Quebec City. So at the end of the 19th century, you had Montisambert, who became superintendent, and then he became the first Director General of Public Health in Canada from 1899 until 1919. So this is just pictures of, you can still visit Gros-Îles today. So the installations are still there. This is something a bit amazing. So the showers, the ovens for all the clothing and everything. So he ended in 1919. Keep in mind that 1919, this is Spanish flu. This is where Public Health Agency, for the first time, massively intervened in the economy. So isolation of the disease, setting up temporary hospitals, mandatory mask, no public gathering, no spitting in the street, closing of schools, theaters, churches, retailers, except for groceries and for basic necessities, and then circulating information about preventative measures. So when you read that today, it's just, that was 2020 for us. 2020, before we had the vaccine, that's basically the same recipe that was applied. The difference between 1918 is we didn't have any vaccine against the Spanish flu. The difference we have today, well, it's pharmaceuticals. It's just your consequences of the Spanish flu. 50,000 dead in Canada. A third of inhabitants in Labrador died. Mortality rate from 30% and to 85% in some Inuit community, for example. So the main difference today is the development of vaccines. So we have vaccine technology, but at the same time, we have what we can call financialized capitalism. So there's how we produce vaccines, how we manufacture them, how we distribute them, and who benefits from all this. And this is something very, very important. Keep in mind that most of the vaccines, so these are the main companies that managed to produce a vaccine against COVID-19. Moderna, there was zero private investment behind Moderna. Pfizer says, well, we do have a lot of private investments, so it makes sense for us to charge margin for profits, etc. Yes and no. The thing is, keep in mind, with these vaccines, we had, so during the pandemic, we developed a new series of economic system in place. So for example, advanced market commitments. This idea of advanced market commitments, so basically, even before the vaccines arrives on the market, we set up procurement system where countries says, we're paying for the vaccines even if it doesn't make it, even if it's not approved in the end. So it's a system to de-risk all the investments that are being done on COVID-19 vaccines. So if you have no investments or investments without any financial risks, the question is, why the heck do we have patents? Patents were put in place in order to compensate investors for the financial risks they were taking over with their investments when it comes to these new technologies. Now we develop alternatives, so patents should simply not be there. But we live in a system of financialized capitalism, which means that vaccines are first and foremost financial assets. It's financial assets in terms of how much we can sell right now, how much we can sell in the future, and especially when it comes to Pfizer and Moderna with mRNA technology. This mRNA technology, so the COVID-19 vaccine is the first vaccine with this type of technology, but this is a technology that is super promising for all these other diseases and oncology against cancer, etc. And the thing is, well, these companies do not want to share the technology, the knowledge, the accumulated over this. It's just, and they can say, well, the other countries cannot start producing themselves. That would be too complicated. Technology transfer is necessary. It requires a lot of training. Absolutely. But in 2020, nobody knew how to make any vaccine. Since October 2020, there's been repeated demands, especially by developing countries, in order to be allowed to have what we call a TRIPS waivers, suspending patent rights over COVID-19 technology to make sure that every manufacturing capacity for vaccines is being put to work to basically participate in the war effort against this pandemic. So in Canada, for example, we had Nuvax, so a small company in Montreal. For months, we're saying, we have the facilities. We are ready to produce the vaccines. We just need the authorizations for this. We had Providence Therapeutics in Alberta in terms of sharing mRNA technology with vaccine producers. We can do that, but we don't have the proper authorizations to do this. And now more recently, BioLease in Ontario. BioLease is just, we have a bit of a system that the Canadian access to medicines regime. You have one, well, Bolivia, so low and middle income country, that went forward and asked to have access to the vaccine through the Canadian access to medicines regime. And BioLee said, we can produce that, but we still do not have the proper authorizations. We'll map up vaccinations, basically in low and middle income countries, especially in Africa. It's still a dire situation. So this is the number of doses per 100 people. Keep in mind, we need 2 doses. Countries' positions on waiving monopolies for COVID-19 medical tools. So the TRIPS waiver. In yellow, these are the countries who sponsored the idea. In green, countries that support the idea. And we have in orange countries opposing the idea. And nothing is being done about this. Now, if you look at the profit and revenues by Pfizer, so revenues since 2016, what we see is that COVID-19 managed to almost double the revenues of Pfizer. So huge profit, so the profit margins are huge for the Pfizer vaccine. And the forecast right now for Pfizer and Moderna is that in next year, the forecast for the sales of the vaccines will double as compared to 2021. So these are really cash machines, but these cash machines require keeping control over the technology. And even in spite of all the initiatives that were put in place to share the technology, these drug companies have been massively opposed in order to make sure to not provide the necessary authorizations for other manufacturers that can manufacture the vaccine right now, start producing this as a part of the war effort. So in many ways, pandemics are a mirror to ourselves. What do we see when we look in the mirror of COVID-19?
Well, thank you, Marc-Andre.